Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. My name is Joe Houlihan. I organise the military history talks here at the BRLSI, and we've got an interesting programme coming up, not least tonight's talk, but next month, for example, the broadcaster and journalist Jonathan Dimbleby will be here giving a talk on the subject of who we can really credit with winning the Second World War. And he won't be talking direct to the audience. He's going to be in conversation with tonight's speaker, Francis Pike. And I think that'll be a really interesting event. In July, we're running a 3-part series of talks on Bath in the Second World War, or Bath at War. They're on 3 consecutive weeks. One of the talks will be about the Bath Blitz, one about the role of the Admiralty in Bath, and the speaker for that talk, David, is here tonight. And another talk about Bath's contribution to the war effort in terms of what our local industry did, which is quite surprising, and they came up with some very interesting contributions to the war effort. Details of these talks are all on the BRLSI website. Before we get tonight's talk going, a little bit of housekeeping, as always. In the unlikely event of an emergency, please leave the building the same way you came in, down the stairs, out through the front, turn right again at the corner, and the official mustering area is the little area of grass with the Roman temple monument. For those of you joining online, and we have several people online tonight, please could I ask you to keep yourself muted during the talk, and then you're welcome to post questions in the chat function, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. And obviously we'll have questions in the room as well. So tonight's talk, and thank you all for coming. I hope you've had a good bank holiday weekend, and you're rounding it off with a nice light topic tonight. So Francis Pike studied history at Cambridge. He's an economic and global political advisor. I don't think I'm giving too much away when I say he's just come back yesterday from a trip to Georgia, and not the American one. Francis lived and worked for 20 years in Japan, China, and India. He's advised financial institutions and governments in Japan, Australia, India, China, Singapore, Bangladesh, Europe, Eastern Europe, Middle East, the US, anywhere. You've done the whole world, really, haven't you, Francis? He's a widely published journalist. He's a regular contributor to The Spectator. He's the author of 2 very highly regarded history books. One is Empires at War, a short history of modern Asia since World War II. And also Hirohito's War, the Pacific War, 1941 to 45. Tonight he's going to be giving us a unique perspective, I think, on the conditions in Japan that can be said to have led to its conduct in the Second World War, which is obviously a topic that has been much discussed and debated. So please join me in welcoming Francis Pike.
First of all, can I just thank you for coming out on Bank Holiday Monday? You must all be very desperate to come and listen to a talk about death cults. Before I get into it, I'll just give some background as to how I came to this subject, and it is relevant to what I'm going to talk about tonight. This was in 1984. I was in Japan, living in Japan, and I went on a driving tour of Japan, and I went to the island of Shikoku, which is the smallest of the 4 big islands of Japan. And I went there, actually, I went to a place called Matsuyama because I wanted to go and bathe in the oldest bathhouse in Japan, the 16th century building, but that's somewhat irrelevant. But I then, from Matsuyama, I took a small ferry. I was taking it to Hiroshima across the spectacularly beautiful inland sea. And as I was taking the ferry, I was up on deck looking at this magnificent view. It was a beautiful sunset evening. The sea is dotted with thousands of islands with magnificent, beautiful trees. It really is one of the most spectacular sights I've ever seen anywhere. And I wondered why were no Japanese on deck looking at this incredible sight. So I went down to the main cabin where there were about 30 Japanese there, and they were all watching a film called Tora, 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 which I thought was interesting. And I arrived just at the moment when the American battleship, was it the Arizona, was hit and turned to, as you probably know, about 1,600 people died, went to the bottom of the ocean and so on. And as the American ships were being hit, all these Japanese men were going, "Banzai, banzai," which is the classic Japanese war cry. And it sort of means long live the emperor. This was really quite shocking because I thought, well, this could never happen in Germany, something like this. So I went back on deck and thought about it, and I thought, I've got to write about Japanese history. So that was how I came to become a writer and write about the Pacific War. And it was, in a sense, appropriate to tell this because I was on the way to Hiroshima, which is a city I've been to numbers of times, and it is a very fascinating place and obviously a very controversial story. And this is the story which I'm going to explain now. First of all, what is a death cult? Well, this is my definition. I would define it as an extreme devotional veneration of a subject, of a person, or of a religion. And secondly, I would say the death cult is defined by a willingness to both kill for your devotion and to be killed for your devotion. It is not. You have to differentiate the death cult from individual acts of bravery. Of course, we all revere people who've won the Victoria Cross for acts of bravery. Now, that is not a death cult. That's an individual decision. A death cult is a manifestation of a collective, a collective view, a collective paranoia, if you like, an extreme, I would say, perverse devotion to a subject, for which you're prepared to both kill and be killed. Its characteristics tend to be extreme violence, mass killing, and very often it's characterized by the cutting off of heads, and we will come to that later. To give some background to this, if you look at the development of what I call ultranationalism in Japan, it really starts with the overthrow of the Tokugawas. The Tokugawas ruled Japan from 1603 for about 250 years. And their end came in 1868 when two tribes from the south, one called the Choshu tribe from the south of Honshu, and the other called the Satsumas from Kagoshima on the island of Kyushu. They combined forces to overthrow the Tokugawa. And in this process, they decided every revolution needs to have a propaganda point to say why their revolution is justified. And for the Satsuma and Choshu, their justification was they were going to restore the emperor. And the emperor had existed all the time. In fact, there's a continuous line of emperors going back thousands of years. But the emperor during the Tokugawa period, he existed. There was a court, but he had absolutely no importance whatsoever. And so what the Choshu and Satsuma did was they restored him to what they decided was the appropriate place. And that's why it's not called the Meiji Revolution. It's called the Meiji Restoration. It's the restoration of the emperor. And the end came at the Battle of Toba, Fukushima, although the war carried on for a couple of years after that. And then it was a question of how they would sort out the constitution and who would rule Japan. And what happened was that the Choshu basically took control of the army, and the Satsuma took control of the navy. And in general, over the next 90 years, that was how the power lay in military terms. The emperor, when he became emperor, he was only 16 years old, so he was not really fully developed or in control of the empire or the country. But the constitution, when it was promulgated 20 years after the Meiji restoration, made him de facto an absolute monarch. It helps if you're a god, and he was a god. But he was not only a god, he also had complete command of the army, so he was head of the army. He was also invested with the right to appoint the prime minister. So it was theoretically, it was a position of extreme power. Now, in practice, that power was rarely used, but he could use it. So let's leave it at that for the moment. Already, as you had this creation of a unified Japanese state without the Tokugawa, you had the rise of ultranationalism, and this very often happens when you get a revolution and a new regime comes into being. And I think it's no coincidence that Japan, the modern Japan, came into being in 1868, just 4 years before Germany was unified by Bismarck. And these two powers, as we know, became the two powers that disrupted the world in the 20th century. So this just explains Article 4 of the Constitution. The emperor is head of the empire, combining in himself the rights of sovereignty. So the modern mythology is, and this was promoted by the West after the Second World War, that the emperor was not absolute. He was absolute. One of the key features of ultra-nationalism as it developed were two things. These are called the Imperial rescripts. One applied to the army and one applied to broad education. And they were both ultra-nationalist documents, which were the basis of teaching in schools and the basis of teaching in the army. So the military rescript, which was the first that came out, basically it put forward what I would call a pseudo Bushido culture, so a pseudo samurai culture, if you like. And so you had phrases like "duty is heavier than a mountain, death is lighter than a feather." It was an encouragement to people in the armed forces to fight to the death, and it was one of the problems in the Second World War that the Japanese soldier thought it was absolutely appalling when English or American or Australian soldiers surrendered. They couldn't understand this. So that was one of the reasons why they treated them so bad. There was complete disrespect for anybody who surrendered. One of the things that happened when the Meiji Restoration came about was the new powers in Japan went on an extraordinary expansionary phase. So in Hokkaido, there were some Japanese people populated there who'd moved there, but essentially the indigenous inhabitants were the Ainu, and these are basically if you like, a white Indian tribe, and they were conquered, moved out, pushed aside, rather like the American settlement of the West versus the Red Indians, and they still exist today. So that was the first thing that happened, was this colonization of the northern island of Japan. The next thing that the regime did was to conquer the Ryukyu Islands. The Ryukyu Islands, the main island is Okinawa, which I'm sure you've heard of, and they historically they were under they were a vassal state, if you like, to China. So they had pay China funds and so on. So the new Japanese regime conquered the Ryukyu Islands, forced the resignation of the king of the Ryukyu Islands, and incorporated the Ryukyu Islands into the province of Okinawa. Next came the really major expansion, which was the attempt to deny Russia and China access to Korea. The fight was really about control for Korea. And the first Sino-Japanese War, they defeated the Chinese and really became top dog in Asia. Historically, we've got to remember that China really until about 1820, 1830 was the most powerful country in the world. And the first Sino-Japanese War was really the transfer of major power status from China to Japan at that point. We then had the conquest, if you like, of Korea, which was being fought over by China, the Russians, and Japan. In the end, the Japanese won, and they won because they won the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. The Battle of Tsushima is bigger in importance in Japanese history than the Battle of Trafalgar is to us. It was probably the most important naval battle. In fact, after the Battle of Trafalgar, it's probably the next most important battle. And the hero of the Admiral Togo was the most, rather like Nelson, was the most revered man in Japanese history. And that was later to have quite a profound effect on Japanese military policy. The result of that was that Japan got control of Korea. First of all, they killed Queen Min, who was brutally murdered by Japanese agents. And then 5 years later, they did a full annexation of Korea, and Korea became the major Japanese colony. I should also add that after the first Sino-Japanese War, Japan got Taiwan. So that was their booty from the first war. So what I'm building up here is a picture of a country which was rapidly expanding, was incredibly confident in itself, where ultranationalism was developing, and this is the lead up to the development of this death cult. This is the background. And I think it's important to understand how this developed. Now, after the first emperor of the Meiji restoration, the second emperor came along. Now, he was a problem because he was sort of congenitally deficient, and he was a simpleton. And he married and had children, but he was really pretty useless in every way. And this was worrying for the authority, for the people who really controlled and ran Japan. And it was worrying because what they could see, and I'll just show this, I'm showing a map of Europe, which you may think is bizarre, but it was worrying for the Japanese, because in the First World War, so many of the imperial families had fallen, had just disappeared. They disappeared, obviously, in Russia. They disappeared the Ottoman Empire. The ruling family disappeared there. In Austria, the Kaiser in Germany. So it looked to the Japanese as though the world was falling apart, and they were worried that the same sort of revolutionary movement would overthrow the emperor system in Japan. And so they really went on the offensive with a propaganda campaign to boost the idea of the Japanese system, what they called the kokutai, the god system, if you like, of Japan. And now we come back to the intellectual side of the rise of ultranationalism and what I would call National Socialism. Now, the grandfather of the ultranationalists, the extreme right, or actually they were extreme left, actually, but we tend to call them the extreme right, but actually they're rather like National Socialists in Germany. They were socialists rather than being on the right. But leave that aside. The first key figure, the godfather of the ultranationalist movement, Mr. Toyama, he was the leading figure in what was called the Black Ocean Society. And the Black Ocean Society was a secret society which promoted extreme ultranationalist views within institutions in Japan. And there were a whole series of these figures who became very important in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. One of these, called Ikikita, wrote a book calling for a reinvigoration or recreation and modernization of Japan's role in the world. And it has been compared to Mein Kampf. But it was published 6 years before Mein Kampf. And I would argue that actually National Socialism rose in Japan before it rose in Germany, which is, it's a controversial view, but I think it's supported by the evidence. And the leaders of these movements had inherited a lot of the ideas that were prevalent with National Socialists in Germany. So Social-Darwinism, the idea that it was the survival of the fittest, and Japan bought into that idea. And they developed this idea that they were an exceptional people destined to dominate Asia, in a sense rather like the German Third Reich. And the other thing which is maybe somewhat surprising is that a lot of these ultranationalists became obsessed by the Jewish problem, which you would think, well, there weren't many Jews in Japan in the early 20th century. But some of the ideas they developed were that the Jews were being supported by the Christian West to get control of the world. Now, that may sound ridiculous, and of course it was ridiculous, but it's an idea which is still prevalent in Japan today. And the number of times I was in bars in Japan with Japanese businessmen in an evening after a few whiskeys, they would whisper in my ear and they say, "How is it that the Jews control everything in the West?" That idea is still prevalent in some circles in Japan. And one of the most popular books in Japan, with huge numbers of editions printed, was the Elders of Zion, the famous fake book about the Jews, became very popular in Japan. So this was the intellectual background, and it infected really every area of Japanese society. It infected the bureaucracy. It infected obviously the army and the navy. Really, there was no area of Japan where these very extreme views didn't become infiltrated. Even the royal family, even the Imperial family, particularly Hirohito's younger brother Chichibu, became very much involved in these strange sects. Here's Hirohito, the Godhead. As General Tojo, who was the main prime minister during the war, said, "The emperor is the Godhead, and we, no matter how hard we strive as ministers, we are nothing more than human." And I think it's maybe perhaps difficult to understand, but even the Navy, Admiral Yamamoto is often thought of in the West as being a sort of moderate and not really in favor of the war. But Admiral Yamamoto, every day he would get on his knees, turn his head towards the Imperial Palace, wherever he was in the world, and make his prayers to the god, Emperor Hirohito. There were also problems in Japan with extreme unhappiness with the West. They felt they'd been diddled out of their place in the world. First of all, they were very upset. These are long-term complaints. They were very unhappy about, for example, American racial laws, which did not permit Japanese people to buy land in Japan. There was big emigration to America. And there were 13 states that passed really very racist laws against Asians, particularly Japanese, from buying land in America. So that was a resentment. There was a resentment that at the Treaty of Portsmouth after the Russia-Japanese War, there was a resentment that America, Teddy Roosevelt, had mediated the peace settlement between Russia and Japan, and that he'd sided with Russia, and that Japan hadn't got its just deserts for winning the war. And then later there was unhappiness at the London Naval Conference, where America and Britain forced Japan to accept less capital ships, because you ought to remember the battleship and the ironclad ships were the great weapons, the weapons of mass destruction, if you like. And so they felt slighted that America got a ratio of 5, Britain 5, Japan 3. So that was a cause of great upset. So gradually you're building up this resentment within Japan towards the West. And now we get the start of really the Chinese problem for Japan. Japan decided that it wanted to expand its empire further north, and the place that they chose was Manchuria. Now, the reason for that is that Japan's main fear actually was not America. Japan's main fear was Russia, and so they did a black flag operation. It's called the Mukden incident, where they blew up a train, and the train sort of wobbled, but that was enough for them to say, "Oh, we were being attacked by Chinese nationalists," and so they used that as an excuse to basically take control of Manchuria. And in Manchuria, they built a military empire, and which again strengthened the army and the extreme ultranationalists. You had the start of the warfare between China and Japan, and this is the Shanghai incident where you had the bombing of Shanghai, and it was a pretty shocking thing, widely reported in the West, and that started to turn the West very much against Japan and what Japan was doing, and so much so that Japan left the League of Nations. It's one of the first countries to leave the League of Nations. And between 1932 and 1936, you had simmering revolt within the armed forces in Japan, and a series of spectacular murders of businessmen. Because you remember that this National Socialist movement was actually very left wing, and so you had murders of businessmen, you had murders of politicians, you had murders of bureaucrats. The first big occasion was 1932, and in 1932, one of the people murdered was Prime Minister Inukai, and this was weirdly connected to the West in that when Inukai was murdered, they expected to find in his house, when they came to his house to murder him, they expected to find Charlie Chaplin, which is a bit odd, but Charlie Chaplin was seen as this incredibly famous, probably the most famous American at the time. And so they were going to kill Charlie Chaplin. But luckily for Charlie Chaplin, Prime Minister Inukai's son had taken him to see the summer sumo basho, the summer sumo tournament. So Charlie Chaplin survived this first uprising. In 1936, again, you had another uprising by these are young troops who supported ultranationalist views, and again they killed politicians and bankers and so on. And that was really it was a deciding moment in 1936. By that time, increasingly the state was becoming more and more authoritarian and more anti-West. So you had this brief period between from the end of the First World War to 1932, where you had people playing jazz. You had baseball became very popular. So you had this sort of Enlightenment period, but gradually the state started to close down these more liberal elements in society. And so you had the Kempeitai, the secret police, clamping down on individual freedoms. New laws, authoritarian laws were passed. But in a way, it was a little bit similar in a way to what Hitler was doing in Germany at the time. And so, one of the most popular slogans was after this time was, "Down with Babe Ruth" became a popular slogan. The famous baseball player. And this also reflects itself in foreign policy too. You had really the start of a very aggressive now move by the Chinese to take control of the coastal areas of Japan. This is again, as I said earlier, cutting off heads is one of the things that seems to mark out death cults. And this is a man about to have his head chopped off. Now, we may have one or two pictures here, which, if you're squeamish, please close your eyes for a few minutes, because these are pretty terrible pictures. So I warn you now. I think the next one. This is a man having his head cut off. Please do turn away if you don't like this. But this is having his head cut off, the rape of Nanking. After the Japanese had taken Shanghai, they then moved their armies north. And the famous rape of Nanking happened. 250,000 people were murdered in Nanking. And this is the start of an extraordinary genocide in China, which is very little understood or known in the West. And the Japanese, in the end, they killed about, nobody knows exactly, but estimates are about 30 million people. So it's a far bigger genocide than the Holocaust. And please close your eyes to the next one if you're squeamish. The next one is a picture of a woman and baby having their heads cut off at the same time. So I won't linger on that. And then we get to the Second World War. Well, the Second World War really happens very briefly. I'll explain this. It happens because the United States decides that it doesn't want China to conquer. So it doesn't want Japan to conquer China. And so what it does in 1941, it cuts off Japanese funding to be able to buy products in America. And this was done by a man called Dean Acheson, who later became famous Secretary of State after the war. And the result was that Japan couldn't buy oil. Now, at that time, Standard Oil of California was the biggest oil producer in the world. It produced 60% of the world's oil. And Japan got almost all that oil from California. So what they were what were they to do? Were they going to they'd been fighting in China for 5 years. They'd lost 1 million men already, and they hadn't won. They were still engaged in fighting the Chinese. So the humiliation of having to retreat from China was really just too much to bear. And this is why, in the end, they attacked Pearl Harbor, as we all know. And the purpose of that was to basically crush the Japanese Navy. And here they had in mind the Battle of Tsushima, where I mentioned Admiral Togo and the great battle. They thought if they won a crushing victory, as they'd done against the Russians, that they could then negotiate a settlement whereby they could have oil and they could control China. Their other objective in the start of the war was to control Southeast Asia and get oil from what were called the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, which they produced about 7% of the world's oil at the time. So that was their secondary plan, and that's why they attacked Malaysia. In fact, Malaysia was attacked before Pearl Harbor. The idea that Pearl Harbor was the first episode of the war, it wasn't. It was in Malaya, actually. It started about an hour before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And the war took place over a phenomenally large area, as you can see there. We tend to think of the Second World War as being a European war with a bit of Asia added on the side, but in geographic terms, the area covered by the war was extraordinarily large. And this was a problem for Japan, because they didn't have the logistics, they didn't have the merchant ships, they didn't have the oil with which to supply their armies spread around all the islands of the South Pacific. And it was one of the reasons why the Japanese army became more and more brutal, because it was itself brutalized by their own commanders. They had to live off the land. They couldn't be supplied with food. So when we think of the prisoner of war camps, the prisoners not having enough food, well, neither did the Japanese army. So part of the, I think, brutality and the increasing extremeness of the death cult, if you like, comes from the fact they were being brutalized too. Let's take their fighter pilots never had leave. They never had furlough. There was no system of rescuing pilots if they fell into the sea. So you had an army which was really on the edge of being able to fight. And of course, they'd been fighting for 5 years in China. So they were at their full capacity already with China on their hands. And I think this is one of the reasons why you had this very, very savage behavior by the Japanese army. The other thing, of course, is a lot of the camps were run by Koreans who'd been co-opted by the Japanese, and the Japanese beat down on the Koreans, and the Koreans beat down on their prisoners. So that's just a picture of the Japanese Empire at its peak, and north to south, you're talking about huge distances, and conveying goods between those places was extremely difficult, particularly when America got control of the sea. So in the end, most of the Japanese submarines, and they had amazing submarines. They had the biggest submarines at that time ever built. In fact, they had cargo submarines, which went to Europe and picked up gold and special raw materials, including uranium, because they were building their own bomb, of course. And they also picked up medical equipment so that they could torture people in the death camps in Manchuria. So they couldn't use their navy properly because they had to use it for ferrying stuff about. The myth that Hirohito was not involved was a sort of constitutional monarch, not really involved in the fighting or the war. It's just not true. He had a huge war room under the palace in Tokyo. He led on a white horse. He led the victory parades, and he reveled in the victories of the Japanese army. So let's just get rid of that one. I mean, if anybody should have stood before the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, he should have been the first man on the roster. He wasn't even allowed to be a witness. It was very corruptly done, but this is not the subject of this talk, but I thought I'd mention that. I think we all know about the atrocities committed in the death camps and so on. The first major one was the famous Bataan Death March, where thousands of American soldiers died after General MacArthur's troops had been surrounded and had surrendered. So that was the first famous death march. Here is just this is just a brief list of some of the massacres and atrocities, murders that took place throughout the Japanese empire. I mean, this is quite extraordinary list, and you know, I could pick any one of these and give you appalling stories of what the Japanese soldiers did. There's POWs on the Burma Railway. We all know about the bridge on the River Kwai, you know, passed down now into our popular culture. I think what people don't realize that, again, Changi in Singapore became a famous prisoner of war camp, particularly for the British. But compared to some of the other camps, it was like a holiday camp. It really, that was where you wanted to be. And even though they were skeletal in the camp, the survival rates were much higher in Changi in Singapore than they were in some camps. You lost 60-70% of inmates were killed. One of the things I found when I went to Nagasaki, for instance, I found some records showing the survival rates of prisoners of war, because there were quite a lot of prisoners of war in Nagasaki when the bomb fell, actually. But what was amazing was to me that these are young men, and 25% of them died in the 3 years that they were in the prison camps in Nagasaki. That's an extraordinary ratio. This one, I'm going to skip this one and go to, this is just showing that the Japanese couldn't sustain their war effort because they were losing cargo ships so rapidly that their whole empire was starving. So you had, in some islands in the Pacific, for example, Bougainville, you had 65,000 soldiers. 40,000 of them died of starvation because they couldn't be supplied by the merchant fleet. And this happened throughout Southeast Asia. Again, their oil inventories, they got to the Dutch East Indies and found they didn't have the technicians to get the oil out of the ground. So the oil production kept falling. So that maneuver to go to the Dutch East Indies to get oil just didn't work. Again, this started to cripple their ability to fight. That increased the brutality with which they dealt with prisoners, because they really couldn't cope with them. The rape of Nanking, actually, one of the things that happened was that the Japanese worked out they just didn't have enough food to feed the people in Nanking, which is one of the reasons why they killed everyone, 250,000 people. And they even brought special oil to burn the bodies, because that's that they had at that time. They had some oil to do that. Big moment here, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. We tend to think of the Battle of Midway, which is the deciding battle of the war, but actually there were 5 other aircraft carrier battles in the war. This was the last battle, and it's significant. I'll just first explain the battle. Imagine a battle involving 1,000 ships. On a scale, imagine the battle taking place from a distance from the Shetlands to Southampton. That was the scale of the battle, and it was the biggest battle in history in terms of the numbers of ships involved. And what remained of the Japanese fleet, because they'd already suffered a massive defeat a few months earlier at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But what remained of the fleet was really completely destroyed. But there was a key thing that happened in that battle, and that was General Onishi said, look, we can't win. In the air, we're being destroyed. Already by 1943, for every American airplane shot down, there were 10 Japanese planes being shot down. So they were already being massively outclassed by the new American planes that were coming into service. So General Nishi said, what we've got to do is we've got to set up special attack groups. And this is the kamikaze, which we all know about. And so that was the key moment at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the kamikaze system started to be put into institutional practice. Over the next months, going into 1945, up until until the Battle of Okinawa, after the Battle of Okinawa, there were 2,700 kamikaze attacks, and they killed about 11,000 American servicemen, some English too. We had a slight advantage in England because our aircraft carriers had steel landing decks, whereas the Americans had wooden landing decks, and the steel decks, the bombs just bounced off. I tried to explain this to an American officer on board the World War II aircraft carrier that's based in New York, and he was very unhappy that I knew more about aircraft carrier design than he did. But anyway, I digress. So that's where the kamikaze thing happened, and as you approached Japan, the kamikaze attacks got worse and worse, more intensive, and the casualty numbers in the American forces got worse. This is an example of a young guy and his attack on the Bunker Hill, which is a carrier, U.S. carrier, and this cult was encouraged in the Japanese media, in the government. You had parties to celebrate people flying off to kill themselves and the enemy. And the schoolgirls waved off with flowers. They drank quite a lot of sake. Quite often the pilots got quite pissed before they got into their airplanes. Sometimes the wives committed suicide to be with their husbands. Sometimes the wives even got into the cockpit with their husbands to fly off with their husbands. So you had this just extraordinary sort of depraved suicidal cult took over in Japan. You also had the civilian population being encouraged to commit suicide. And in Saipan, on the cliffs in Saipan, you had hundreds of women, children jumping off the cliffs, the Marubi cliffs, to kill themselves, even pregnant women. And the Japanese soldiers who were arriving, they just couldn't believe what they were seeing. But the emperor had sent a rescript, which was basically an order saying that if you commit suicide as a civilian, you'll be given the same rights in heaven as if you were in the army and died fighting. So there was encouragement from the top for Japanese people to commit suicide. This is a rare photograph, a Japanese guy surrendering. This didn't happen very often. In fact, they complained, the American army was always complaining that not enough people were surrendering. So they couldn't get the intel that they wanted from prisoners. And the reason they didn't was because when they were fighting the Japanese forces, rather than giving up, because the Imperial rescript, the military rescript said you can't surrender. You've got to fight to the death. General Slim, the great British general of the Pacific War, he one of the things he said was that every army says they're going to fight to the death. The Japanese were the only ones who did it. And so what happened when they ran out of bullets right at the end of a battle on an island, they would do this banzai charge, long live the emperor. That would be their last words. And they charge at the Western forces, sometimes overrun them and kill a lot of people. But in the end, they would all be killed. And that's why you've got these extraordinary death rates. This chart, I analysed all the major island battles in the Pacific War. And one of the reasons why it's interesting, because at the island battles, you could go around and count all the bodies. So you know actually how many people have died. You couldn't do that in Papua New Guinea or elsewhere because people just died in the jungle and you never found them. But here you could go around the island, and the Americans sent teams to go around the island and analyse how many people had died and even what they died of. Were they killed by grenades? Were they killed by bullets? They did an analysis to work out what sort of weapons they needed for these island campaigns. And the death rates in the first 10 of these that I analysed, the death rates were averaged about 95, 96%, which is unbelievable. There's no other army I've ever, or no other fighting group I've ever analysed where such a high proportion of people were killed. And this is one of the unique things about the war is the extreme death rates that were incurred. So, we tend to think of, I'm sure you've all heard of the Battle of El Alamein, which is 100,000 Brits against 100,000 Germans. Well, how many Germans died out of the 100,000? 5,000. Okay. Similar numbers, Battle of Kohima, which was General Slim against General Mutaguchi on the borders of India. Similar numbers, but out of the 100,000 Japanese men in that battle, 70,000 died. 70%. So there's a complete difference to the Western theatre. But one of the things you notice here, on the right-hand side, far right, is the Battle of Okinawa. And you notice the last two battles, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the number of American dead starts to increase dramatically as you get nearer Japan. And this was a real concern for the Americans. And it was concern because Franklin Roosevelt had said, we will demand unconditional surrender from the Japanese. And of course, that's what they had got from Germany. And to do that, they felt they would have to invade Japan. But they started to work out how many people would be killed. And they got a man called William Shockley, who was a physicist, and the State Department employed him. Can you do an analysis of how many people you think are going to be killed? And he used, I think, statistics similar to the ones that I've done, which showed that as many as 500,000 Americans would lose their lives in the conquest of Japan. Because they knew the Japanese had armed 25 million civilians had been armed to fight to the death. You had 4 million soldiers. On Japan, you had waiting and ready for the Japanese invasion. I've already said you had, up until that point, you had 2,500 kamikaze pilots that killed 11,000 people. But you had ready and waiting 12,000 kamikaze pilots, 12,000 planes ready to attack. So the death and killing would have been on an extraordinary scale. You also had, a lot of people don't know, you had kamikaze speedboats. You even had kamikaze torpedoes where they designed systems where a Japanese guy would sit on a very big torpedo with a steering mechanism, and he would ride the torpedo to go and sink a boat. So faced by this, you start to understand, I think, why the American president, when the bomb had been developed, had no choice but to use it. Because can you imagine an American president decides to invade Japan, conquer Japan, and then at the end of the war, when he's conquered Japan, he goes back to his people. He said, well, I had a war-ending bomb, an atom bomb, But rather than use it, I sacrificed 500,000 American lives. What president could possibly have done that? There was no choice, given what was already understood and known about the suicidal tendencies of Japanese people, the way that they'd been indoctrinated. There was really no alternative choice. This is, and one of the other things that people don't understand, the atom bomb was just another bomb in the end. People didn't know about the carcinogenic effects of atom bombs. And, a friend of mine, who took this picture, actually, he arrived, he was a sub-lieutenant on the battleship HMS Duke of York. He stopped in Cure. He went to his admiral on the ship and said, do you mind if I get on the train and go to Hiroshima? This is a few weeks after the war. So he walked around Hiroshima, took photographs. He had no idea that there was the potential of being irradiated. So there were many unknowns as to what would happen. But even had they known, what other choice could a president have, given what they knew about what the Japanese would do? And there were two other facts. One was that the Japanese had plans to murder 150,000 prisoners of war. So ending the war quickly was quite important to save those lives as well. And the other fact which they had to take into, they didn't know that the Japanese didn't have an atom bomb. The Japanese started developing an atom bomb before the Manhattan Project. A man called, Mr. Nishina, had studied under Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, the great physicist. And he'd come back to Japan, he bought some cyclotrons and was starting to enrich uranium. And they had working plans, and quite recently they found working plans for atomic bombs in Japan. So they didn't know for sure that the Japanese themselves didn't have a bomb. So ending the war quickly was really rather important. But the main reason ultimately was the reason of fear of the death cult and the casualties that they would incur. And just to give you some examples, this is after the first bomb was dropped. General and army. Would it not be wondrous for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower, completely nuts? Onishi was the man who formalized the kamikaze. Certain victory. We'd only lose 20 million lives. Certain victory. I mean, these are crazy guys. So I think that hopefully puts into perspective why there really was no choice to use bomb. And they knew when the bomb landed on Hiroshima, they knew what it was because they were developing their own bomb. So they knew it was an atom bomb. And they sent people down there to investigate and so on, but they knew what it was. And they were a bit surprised that Japan didn't surrender. If I was prime minister, somebody dropped an atom bomb on my country and I didn't have one to throw back, and I'd surrender pretty quickly. But the Japanese didn't, because the military commanders refused to accept defeat. They would rather Japan was destroyed like a beautiful flower. And even as the emperor finally he surrenders. He gives up, he gives up and surrenders. There's an attempt in the palace to stop the recording going out, stop the surrender being made. But General Ugaki, he's with his squadron down in Kyushu. And he says, look, I'm going to go on the last mission a last kamikaze mission. So the general gets into the plane, and he comes down in the morning, and the entire squadron is lined up. They're all going to go with him. And of course, there's one guy who's left out because Ugaki has taken his aeroplane. So the guy who's left out says, no, I'm going to squeeze into the cockpit with you, General. So he gets into the cockpit and they fly off together. And eventually they're found actually the plane is found nose down in the beach somewhere. So after the war, there's some interesting comments. There's one from the widow of an atomic scientist saying, "Yeah, if we'd built the bomb, we would have used it." Of course, they would. Then that's pretty obvious. I think the comment from Admiral Yonai is pretty interesting, and he said, the bomb was a gift from God because it stopped the war. So there are some Japanese who think actually the dropping of the atom bomb was a really good thing. And then you had the reaction of soldiers. They were about to get on ships to go out to Japan. They all thought they were going to die. And this guy, Paul Fusser, said, "We cried with the relief. We thought we're going to live." And then there's a very interesting comment by Akira Kurosawa, he's the great filmmaker in Japan. He made The Seven Samurai and so on. And he notices that after the surrender, people are happy. The streets are bustling. People are happy. And an extraordinary thing, Japan went from having this death cult to being extreme pacifists literally within 24 hours. And it's a bizarre thing, but the death cult thing just disappeared, went. And pacifism is still, very much the belief system in Japan today. So why did the US drop the bomb? And normally, I think there's very rarely do you say there's a single reason why something happens in history. But in this case, I think pretty much the only reason was that they dropped the bomb to save American lives, because there was no other alternative. And I think that that is absolutely the overwhelming reason. There've been all these conspiracy theories about the bomb was dropped so to stop the Russians doing this and that, and there are different theories, or they wanted to try it out on somebody, or there are all these random theories. But forget these conspiracy theories. There was only one reason, and that was to save the lives of servicemen, American servicemen. And let's also remember, Britain was sending an army out to the Pacific as well. It was estimated that, I think shockingly estimated that between 60 and 100,000 English soldiers would have died. So maybe some of your parents or your fathers would have been killed in Japan if the bomb hadn't been dropped. Now, this is one of the reasons why I wrote a paper for the Asian Review on this subject. And one of the reasons I wrote it was I was shocked that the extent to which American popular support for the dropping of the bomb had fallen in the intervening years. So from 85% support in 45 to 43% support in 2016. I imagine it's probably even lower now. And of course, young people, they're even more against the war. I mean, I've met many Americans who said to me, I'm just appalled that my kids think the atom bomb was terrible. That's been a common thing I found when I've gone to America. So that's I think there does need to be re-education on this, and a better understanding of what actually happened. So one of the things that's the last slide, but one of the things I would say, and there is a problem in history today, and that is military history is hardly taught now in schools, universities. The chancellor of one of the top German universities said to me, "Oh, you picked the wrong subject. Nobody's interested in military history now." But I think that's wrong. I think it's important to understand how wars start, how wars are conducted, how wars end. And, you can you look up new university posts in history departments. It's all about gender history. Complete, from my point of view, I'd say complete rubbish. And I think the downplaying military history, I think is a very big mistake. We have a generation now who've never been even close to being involved in war. And I think it's very important that people understand why war happens and what are the consequences. So that's where I end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for answering. Fascinating talk, and I think your comments at the end, you're hopefully preaching to the choir here, but as the convener for military history, I couldn't agree more, actually. And I notice it with a lot of young people I meet, that their sort of understanding of how military events have shaped the world we're in now and continue to shape it is very low. Great. Look, I know that was a fairly long talk, so we're going to go to some questions. You will all have heard this before if you've been here before, but when I hand you the microphone, for the benefit of our people watching online, can you please hold it very close to your lips? Thank you.
Thank you, Francis. That was a fascinating lecture. I was just wondering whether you can identify a death cult now in the 21st century.
Well, I think in a way this is a very topical subject, because in recent years we've had Al-Qaeda, we've had ISIS, and now we've got Hamas. So, it couldn't be a more topical subject in the end. And throughout history, going back thousands of years, there have been death cults. This is not a new phenomenon. These are phenomena which rise from time to time in societies. And even the Nazis I would describe as a death cult to some degree, not to the degree of Japan, but a lot of people don't know. You had in Germany, you had Leonidas squadrons, which were they were suicide kamikaze squadrons too. And there weren't as many. It wasn't as well developed, but you still had these squadrons. Leonidas, obviously, because of the Spartan general and his famous 300 who defended Thermopylae against the invading Persians. So, death cults part of our culture, and what we're dealing with now in the Middle East is very much part of the history of death cults.
Thank you. There's a question from one of the online audience here. They say they were under the impression that Japanese brutality had been part of the culture for hundreds and hundreds of years, or they'd assumed that to be the case. Are they wrong to have assumed that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, there were certain aspects of Japan which are unique. For example, in Japanese culture, there was nothing wrong with the sneak attack. You had these ronin who would, go in and murder their lord, the famous story of the renegade ronins. So you had that. But what was interesting was that early on in the 19th century, the Navy was known for actually being very considerate to captives. It wasn't, they weren't brutal murderers as they became later. I mean, it's interesting at the Battle of Midway, for example, there's some American flyers were captured, and they were taken aboard ship, and then they were then thrown overboard. And when they clung to the rails, they beat them with rifle butts to make them let go. So they murdered them. Well, in the previous generation, that wouldn't have happened. And it shows that Japan became more and more ultra-nationalist as the 30s progressed, and the death cult really took hold.
All questions in the room? Lady here.
Yes, you mentioned that in 2016 what the figure was in America in support of the war. I'm just wondering if the latest film, Oppenheimer, may have changed that.
I don't know. I'd like to know. I'll try and find out. I thought it was a good film, well portrayed, but whether it changed people's minds, I somewhat doubt. And I think particularly young people, you've got to remember, most top universities now in the West are dominated by what in broad terms we call woke culture, which is very anti-West. It's basically teaching students that the evils of the world have been imposed by the Western powers.
Okay, one here, then we'll come to the back.
There's a lot I can say about what we've rattled through tonight, but one of the things I remember was watching the film Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and what it did was it brought home to me the cultural difference between the war that my father and two of my uncles were involved in against the Germans in Europe compared with the war that my other uncle was fighting against the Japanese in Burma. One of the things that your talk has highlighted is that we don't really seem to have done anything at all to try and investigate and get insight into the cultural differences of the people who might be our enemies or indeed our allies, and that people from different cultures will react to our force or our friendship in extremely different ways, and we need to be prepared to deal with it.
Well, there is one fundamental difference between Japan and the West. Its ethic system is not based on Christianity. So the things that we take for granted in terms of generosity to the poor and the disadvantages is fundamentally different. The ethics system in Japan is very much related to family and regard for family, ancestors, and so on, but not broadly across the board in the way that, say, that Christian ethics might apply in the West. So I think that's a big difference, if you like.
Thank you. My father was in the Navy in Bombay when the bomb dropped. He was anything but a right-wing militarist, and he said everybody felt an enormous sense of relief when it happened. Supports what you've been saying. But my question is, if you look at the Asian countries, I just pick on two. Korea has a very negative attitude towards Japan. Taiwan has a very positive attitude. Japan is their favorite holiday destination.
Yes.
Can you say something about Asian attitude to Japan?
Well, what you have to remember, I'll just start with Taiwan. What you have to remember about Taiwan is it really wasn't run by the last Chinese dynasty. It was very loosely attached. And, it's about 200 miles from the coast to Taipei, from the Chinese coast to Taipei. It's quite a big gap of water. And the Chinese really didn't think much about Taiwan. Even after the war, Mao wasn't terribly interested. He was much more concerned about getting control of China. So actually, when the Japanese got Taiwan and brought it into their empire, it almost became more Japanese than Chinese. So even when I used to go to Taiwan, people still spoke Japanese, and there was quite a lot of people liked Japan, they didn't. I wouldn't say they loved being ruled by Japan, but better, as one person said, better the white pigs than the red pigs. And so you have this very different relationship in Taiwan, actually. And of course, it's also confused by the fact that the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek, took his defeated armies to Taiwan and then brutalized the whole country. So they saw the mainland Chinese who arrived at Chiang Kai-shek as being absolutely appalling and much worse than the Japanese as rulers. So that's why you've got this very different relationship in Taiwan. Korea is different. I mean, I haven't mentioned all the issues of Korean comfort women and the forced labor, people being taken to work in factories in Japan and so on. And the comfort women, maybe 50, 100,000 women were taken for prostitution for use by the Japanese army. So, Korea was pretty badly treated, if you like. And so there's not much love lost. I remember once having a meeting with the managing director of Hyundai, the big Japanese auto company. And this was when they were making about 20,000 cars a year. And he said, well, we're going to be making 200,000 cars in 3 years' time. I said, where are you getting the machine tools? He said, well, I'm going to have to get them from Japan. I tried not to. I went to America to get machine tools. So I didn't want to buy anything from Japan. I even drive a Cadillac. And he said, I just couldn't, I couldn't get them at a possible price. So I had to buy Japanese. But, he was, it's an indication that they really didn't like Japan. And I spent a lot of time in Korea. I've been to South Korea 36 times. So I got to know South Korea quite well. So, yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one last question. We'll have to make it fairly brief, both question and answer, because we're meant to be out by 9 o'clock, I'm afraid.
Thanks. I'm so glad I made it to this talk, because it's been an absolute fascinating look into, the Second World War, which, when I was born, it was a thing of the past. So, thank you very much. But I'd love to hear your analysis of two things, really. One is, I gathered that what drew Japan and Germany together was their sort of both of them feared the Jews taking over commercial control of the world in a way. And so I was wondering how Italy fitted into it. And also the other thing that I would be interested to hear your views on is, if the Hiroshima bombing and the Nagasaki hadn't happened, how do you see the world emerging, from that time?
Well, first on the Jew thing, I don't think it was the dominant issue. It was both countries wanted to assume a place in the world which they felt befitted their narrative, their nationalist, their ultra right-wing nationalist narrative. So I think that was the major driving force, and the Jew thing was a sort of adjunct to that. It's part of the narrative. It wasn't the main part of the narrative, in my view. In Japan, it certainly wasn't the main narrative, but it's quite. It amazes me that the Jew issue was an issue at all in Japan, given how far away they were from the West. On the second question, how the world might be different. Italy. Well, Italy was sort of a minor player, really, in the Axis. The anti-Comintern Pact was basically Germany, Japan, and then Italy sort of joined in later. So, it was, of course, they were autocratic, totalitarian states, Italy too, but it was an alliance, but in the end, it was an alliance that could not possibly win. If you look at the combined GDP at the time of the Allied powers versus the Axis powers, the Allied powers' GDP was 4 or 5 times bigger than the Axis powers. So, in terms of war material, they were always going to have more resources and likely to win. So, I don't think the atom bomb, for example, changed very much in that sense, because they would have conquered Japan, and we'd have a similar structure. Now, I think what might have happened, the Russians had started to invade, and I think they may well have come down to Honshu, and you might have had a German situation where you had a divided Japan between a Russian zone and an American zone, maybe even a British zone. So that I think probably would have been the biggest possible difference if you hadn't had the atom bomb.
Perhaps a more interesting, or another interesting hypothetical would be, what if Japan had looked at the Second World War and thought, we'll sit this one out, because they wouldn't have necessarily had the devastation, but they would still have had that militaristic cult that you've referred to tonight.
Well, that's interesting, but of course, and it's quite possible, had they retreated from China and done what the Americans wanted them to do, but they didn't do it because they couldn't really lose face, then it's quite possible that the emperor would have been toppled, and that you'd had a different system of government in place there. But as with all what-if questions, it's sort of impossible to know.
Okay, well, I think we'll have to call a halt there because of time. I'm sorry to those of you with questions that we couldn't get to. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out tonight, and I hope you all get home safely. Can we have another round of appreciation for Francis Pike?